Hi, everyone. Welcome to the lecture today on the nervous system in pathophysiology. So what we're going to do in this lecture is I'm going to provide you with a review of the nervous system. It's hard to study pathophysiology because you have to remember a lot of anatomy and physiology to sort of understand the disease part of all of this, or the disordered part. So I want to do a brief review. You're going to have to consult some resources once we get into the pathophysiology, if you feel like you're missing something. But I'll try to do my best to bring it in. It's honestly that I try to bring the regular physiology in and then talk about the disorders because that's sort of important. But we don't have a lot of time. So watch this at your own convenience if you feel like you need a brief review. So hopefully it'll be helpful. So let's look at some terms. There's a lot of terms about just the division of the nervous system and how it functions. The ones that you are quite familiar with, I hope, are central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord mainly, and then the peripheral nervous system is how the nerves branch out from there and do function. So that's one division sort of the nervous system, but we also break it down and describe it in other terms of autonomic and somatic. Those are some other terms, and what those relate to they're very functional. The autonomic nervous system are those things that happen kind of automatically without voluntary thought, and you can think of that in terms of the word sort of implies that it's not automatic, but it's very similar, autonomic. Somatic refers to the body and the cells and then, kind of the distribution of a place. So, but basically what that means, or what the term we often use, is voluntary when we think of somatic. These are the things of conscious thought where you say, I want to move my arm. That's not autonomic, it's somatic, it's voluntary. Within the autonomic nervous system itself, we have two other words that we use, parasympathetic and sympathetic, and those kind of describe two types of autonomic function. Sympathetic is, and this controls a lot of the things like your heart rate and, fight and flight. That's part of what we call the sympathetic, when we need to be sort of pumped up. And the parasympathetic is, and I think I have a typo there, sorry about that. The parasympathetic nervous system involves these kind of more of a rest and digest when we need to chill. And both of those things work together to kind of regulate your normal, autonomically regulate your body functions. And then, of course, we have these chemicals that are called neurotransmitters that kind of do a communication between one nerve and the other. Nerves are not next to each other. You have to send an impulse, and it has to cross from one nerve to another. And so we use chemicals, and there's a lot of complex chemistry involved with the neurotransmitters, and a lot of disease states, depression, and some others that we'll talk about. But the basic function of a neurotransmitter is to do a chemical kind of stimulation from one nerve to another. Anyway, so this is a handwritten notes on my part that sort of just briefly describe what I've already recently just talked about, but there's a little bit more here that we're going to get into with this lecture. But this is kind of a cheat sheet, so to speak. The central nervous system is brain and spinal cord. Then you have some structure of how nerves get sent out from both the brain and the spinal cord. But we also over here have the peripheral nervous system. There's some cranial nerves that we talk about. And one of the things that I'm talking about here is this thing called decussation. Decussation is basically when you have, let's say you have a impulse from the nerve that's going out to the periphery. If it crosses over and goes to the other side, we call that decussation. Same if you have a nerve that's coming up with sensory information to the brain for processing, it can still decuss and go from one side to the other. So these are nerves of the cranial system that nerves 2, 12, 4, and 7, and you've probably memorized those in A&P. Those decuss and they switch directions and go to the other side. Those that are not decussed, 1, 5, 8, 9, 11, are just stay on the same side. And so the reason that's important to know what decussates or not is because of injury and which side it will affect and other things. So if you're a nurse and you're doing a diagnostic, one of the you know, there's a screen and battery of tests that you sort of do upon evaluation of a patient, and that a lot of those are evaluating whether or not there's damage to the brain at different locations, but also cranial nerves. And that's why they check eyes and nose, ears, throat, and all that stuff, because they're looking at to see if there's any sort of issues with those cranial nerves. This area over here, if you have an ascending nerve, it's called an afferent or afferent. It's bringing sensory information back up. An efferent is descending, and those are usually motor neurons sending an impulse a voluntary impulse to the muscles. It could be involuntary actually as well. But anyway, it's sending us, if you see efferent or descending, those are usually motor neurons, which are sending an impulse to actually act. The afferent ones are responding with sensory information back to the central nervous system for processing. So that's kind of a brief summary of the divisions, but there's more, of course. Divisions upon divisions upon divisions, actually. So, but anyway, there's cells. You have two types of cells. You have the neurons that you're very familiar with, but then you also have these supportive cells called glial cells that we'll look at. You have masses of nerves called bunches of nerves with cell bodies, and swellings on nerves called ganglion, just a term there. Your brain has different kinds of matter that we talk about. We have gray and white. You have membranes that are called motors. You have dura, arachnoid, and pia mater that kind of are these membranes of the brain that have different disease and disorders of swelling and such nature. Then, of course, you have cerebrospinal fluid. So those are all some terms that you should be familiar with. The central nervous system, there are different brain areas. There's a lot of them. And depending on where your brain has damage will result in the symptom that you see. But anyway, the cerebrum is what we think of more as sensory, but it does have some interplay with motor control as well. But we think of it more as the place where sensory and cognitive processing is occurring. The cerebellum is where we think of more motor control. And the brainstem is what I would generalize as saying has the homeostasis kind of functioning. Anyway, the peripheral nervous system, again, the autonomic, it's not directed, it's not voluntary. It responds to hormones and neurotransmitters, I should say, and hormones that will get you the pumped up for fight or flight. That would be epinephrine. And then you have chill and rest and digest is what we call it, where the parasympathetic neurotransmitter would be norepinephrine. Again, the somatic is kind of directed and voluntary and motor. So that's just my little cheat sheet to kind of break it down for you, but let's go into it a little bit further here. All right, talked about different white and gray matters. You can kind of see this. The gray matter is consisted of cell bodies with axon and terminals and dendrites, different parts of the neurons. The white regions actually contain many of the whole axon and connects different parts of gray matter. So kind of just a bit of a review there, not too much. Just a brief review of the brain membranes. You have skin, and then you have the periosteum, then you have bone, which is your skull. But then you have these three brain membranes. You have the dura mater, or the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Pia is closest to the actual brain, and the dura mater is closer to the skull. The arachnoid is in between, and you can have hemorrhages in between these areas, and depending on where it's at is a different sort of symptoms. All right, again, your neurons and your brain cells. There's mostly we think of neurons, and those are the ones that are releasing neurotransmitters and sending signals between two neurons to basically, mostly we think of doing motor function, but it's other things as well, perceiving sensory information and that sort of thing. There's in a neuron, and this nerve cell is very important because they need to kind of send that electrical impulse. So think of neurons as having axons and dendrites and having action potential and releasing neurotransmitters. Your support cells usually have only one process. They don't have a lot of different processes with the axons and dendrites. But anyway, they don't generate action potential. They don't release neurotransmitters. They do other supporting functions to keep the brain cells going. The classic things like astrocytes sort of help protect the blood-brain barrier, and then you have oligodendrocytes that are involved in creating that myelin sheath for the central nervous system. The Schwann cells do it out in the periphery. All right. One other cell, I'm sorry, I forgot, I had needed to take a break, but ependymal cells down here are very important in the production of cerebrospinal fluid. So there are different cells that have different functions. The ones we think of the most, and probably what you made a drawing of them in 6th grade and labeled the axon and the cell body and the dendrites. But so one thing I want to talk about is at the dendrites and at the axons, there are synaptic clefts. I mean, there's synaptic areas with what we call clefts, and it is at the dendrite where the next neuron is going to receive the impulse from the previous neuron, or the adjacent one, and then it travels down the axon, and it will exit at the end of the axon here at the synaptic terminals, and it will release neurotransmitters to go to the next dendrite of the next neuron. So that's sort of how the impulse gets passed, with a lot of other information, chemistry in between. But anyway, let's go on. So the glial cells, the microglia, like we've already talked about this a little bit, but your brain has to have ability to do phagocytosis as well. And so the microglia are involved in this process. I already mentioned the astrocytes, how they provide a supportive, I talked about them, being very active with the blood-brain barrier, and they're supportive in repair of neurons. There's satellite cells as well that function to similar to astrocytes, but they're in the peripheral nervous system. We talked about the rest of these already, but with the exception of Schwann cells, that are the same as oligodendrocytes. They myelinate the axons, but these are found in the peripheral nervous system. All right. Neuron, here's a picture of a neuron. Classically, you have the cell membrane, dendrites, the axon, the oligodendrocytes that are right here that are creating the myelin sheath, the node of Randier, myelin sheath as well down here. So just a picture of an neuron that you've probably drawn many times. It's early, sorry, I haven't had my coffee. All right, brain, well, I haven't had enough. So brain function, we talked a little bit about this, but the cerebrum, again, think of sensory. There's some motor activity, but that's not the main area where we think about motor, but there's some action there. And associative, like how we bring in information and process it. The cerebellum, motor control and coordination. The diencephalon, this is part of an area called the thalamus, where it's very sensory and manages sleep and wakefulness. It's comprised of this nerve tissue called basal ganglia, where dopamine is produced, and you can have some motor control here with like from a neurotransmitter perspective, where you have some Parkinson's syndromes and hypokinesia and that sort of thing. Anytime you see kinesia, that's about movement. We also have in the diencephalon the hypothalamus that's doing more autonomic control center. That's where we usually refer to that. And it's very closely located near the brainstem, where you have the medulla oblongata that's controlling respiration, blood pressure, swallowing and vomiting, coughing, breathing. Pons is part of that brainstem controlling respiration, and they have midbrain with eye movements. These are general things to try to remind you about the different areas of the brain. So the cerebellum is what we think of as kind of in the skull, and you have the cerebrum is in the skull. The cerebellum is also, but it's out down toward the bottom here, and the diencephalon and brainstem are coming out of the brain and going towards mating up with the spinal cord. All right, you have cerebral spinal fluid. There's some very interesting things. It's kind of a lubricant that's found, and it has other functions as well, but it's found in the ventricles of the brain. There are these, you can see them up here. There's different spaces of the brain where you have fluid in them, and it's really interesting. It's sterile. It doesn't have proteins, but it does contain ions. It can contain glucose as well, and it fills the space of 4 ventricles, and it functions to provide some buoyancy for the brain and some shock absorbance. It also helps remove byproducts and metabolites and responds to volume changes. It plays a part in maintaining those action potentials and handling waste. And it's formed by the choroid plexus, which is special epithelium cells that line the ventricles and kind of create this cerebrospinal fluid. Parenchymal cells also form 30% of cerebrospinal fluid as well. So we'll talk about a condition where you are either have too much cerebrospinal fluid, kind of gets reabsorbed, and if it's not reabsorbed, then you can have too much of it and it will create a problem that we'll talk about later. All right, blood-brain barrier, what does it do? Its main job is to protect us, to keep pathogens and toxins away from our blood supply within the brain. Your brain is kind of unique. It has its own little circulatory and blood supply system. This blood-brain barrier is very selective and semi-permeable. It, again, separates circulating blood from the brain from the extracellular fluid in the nervous system. And that it's kind of a gatekeeper in that membrane sort of way. And it allows passage of water and some gases and some lipid soluble molecules actually go across the brain pretty easy because the brain is very fatty, actually. And it also regulates and monitors the selective transport of molecules such as glucose and amino acids that are crucial to neuron function. Here's another, picture of the blood-brain barrier. The barrier part it's selective and it's selectively permeable. There's these tight junctions is what they're called that kind of restrict movement of water. Cells form different types of associations based on proximity. There's gap junctions and tight junctions, and sometimes it allows or prevents movements of things in and out. So what gets in the brain, and this is very important in drug development and also treating diseases like, depressions and some other things. But fat-soluble compounds will go in: alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, water, some gases and fats are going to go in by what's just called passive transport. What doesn't get in really easy are water-soluble compounds, and the reason why is because of the composition of the brain. So one of the things that the brain really, really likes is glucose, and it's going to get in by a transport molecule. But, so it's selectively semi-permeable. The alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, marijuana, those cross easily, and that's why they have an effect on us. Glucose, like I mentioned, is very important to the brain. I cannot overstate this enough. Your brain will go to great measures to make sure it has a lot of glucose there. It's the primary energy substrate. It uses about, of all the sugar that you take in, your brain uses about half of it. And like I said, it gets in by a carrier protein. And there's some other things that get in, like the L-DOPA gets in through transport proteins as well. And L-DOPA is what's needed to synthesize dopamine. Dopamine can't get in by itself. It has to it kind of has to get carried in and then synthesized by L-DOPA. So anyway, moving on. This is the last slide in this one, just for fun. It's showing some interesting brain scans, and you can see this area right here of the brain that is missing some, this is an autistic person's brain versus a control, which is a normal person's brain. And you can see different areas of activity eliminated for a control here versus here in the autistic brain. Why, we don't know. It's just kind of an interesting slide to kind of see. They can monitor brain activity and through different scans and see a lot of things, actually. It's a very fun thing to study. But here's another scan that's kind of a psychopathic pattern of illumination versus a normal illumination. All right, that's it. Brief, quick, and hopefully helpful.